Welcome to the second episode of Extended Lockout, a podcast covering current WoW content from the POV of two mid-tier CE raiders. Last week I would have almost omitted the CE part, given I wasn't 100% sure we would get that in time. But now with these new nerfs rolling in, it kind of seems almost guaranteed at this point.
I sure hope
Um,
so. And I think that's the intention.
Yeah, and so I've got the nerfs here up on my side screen, and so they nerfed the other three Anduin Lords and Rygolon, and don't really need to cover those because those were very generic. People that were progging them will experience them a little bit easier. I think it's more important to speak more heavily on the Jailer nerfs. We can kind of focus more on the mythic aspect of it, honestly. You know, first biggest thing being the health being reduced on mythic difficulty. You want to give your thoughts on that one?
I mean, less health, boss dies easier. Pretty straightforward.
Yeah, but boss die is easier, but it's also shrinking a latter portion of the fight that many guilds that would have had to have progressed it would see a lot more, right? Like P3 itself is a dance, and if you have to see less of it, just based on the fact that the boss is phasing lower into P3, I think that's honestly a really good approach to how they should nerf Jailer for, say there's a guild that just kills Rygolon this week and now they get to see Jailer. They have less P3 to experience than, say, guilds that have already killed it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the clan was doing some calculations, an officer in our guild break, and we were arguably getting to about 45%, I want to say, going into P3. Uh,
Yeah, I would say we were also still pretty early in P3 prog part,
yes,
and
yes.
so we probably could have gotten that lower just with like further damage optimization and stuff. But 45% as like a safe estimate, yeah, that's
With
fine.
the team that was in at the time, kind of where we were at, yeah. And so he did hardware calculation for that, what the boss nerfs and our damage increases that we'll talk about in a second would adjust to, and he came out to us being in P3 at 37%. Um, like when with the remaining boss HP being 37%. So that's like
That's
something of
of
the
the new
new,
HP.
yeah, of the
Yeah.
new HP. And so it's just um something to consider, like that you can very much intentionally skip portions of E3. Uh, if you choose to lust with the second blood soak, like if you just extend that, get that to a 6 stack, you lust
Yep.
during that point, you're killing all those ads, and then you can almost essentially push the boss around that timing. You probably still get the heal absorb that follows that. Like there's the ads, defile, heal absorb, and then probably right into P4. But
Hmm. I
that
saw some people who weren't sure on Mythic how the transition works, if it's HP based or entirely time based. Whether you could like would you go from P2 straight into P4 at a certain point, or would you s- start P3 early at a certain point? They weren't sure how it worked exactly because I think on heroic, once you hit 30% on the boss HP, it like automatically transitions. But obviously, heroic doesn't have a P4 quote unquote type thing, so it might
but
be different on Mythic.
yeah, it's a good question. It's one of those things that we'll probably see the answer to come Tuesday when the guilds that have cleared it comfortably get
I
to
was gonna say,
experience
yeah,
that.
the people that are farming, yeah, on farm right now, probably. I'm
Um,
definitely interested to see if P1 and P2 become any different, if you change how you're doing the stacks there to try and abuse for the damage increase and keeping that rolling and things like that. I think that has more possible uh merit than maybe guilds that are progging it. And I understand definitely not trying to relearn an earlier phase that you've already mostly uh, got down and consistent. So that's definitely a big factor. But I'm curious if guilds that are starting prog brand new might change that.
yeah,
Probably have to see after a week or two how it works out for people.
right. So just looking over more of the changes, so the stacks of the damage and healing increase that you get, so they were 3% per stack up to 7%. So a lot of people just refer to when you get the 6 stack of the soak. That's pretty iconic moment in the fight, right? You are now going from 18% damage or increased damage and healing to 42% with all
Yep.
those stacks. That's pretty noticeable. And especially if you're lining up with the cooldowns as you were before, but that's just kind of almost exponential at that point, right?
Yeah, I mean, I I am definitely curious as to how they want the fight to work because I think of a lot of their previous nerfs. Like for example, I'm thinking back to Sire, where they changed his health, but they also adjusted how you phased him into, I forget if it was P2 and P3 or just P3. But they also changed like his health percentage of when you transitioned and things like that so that the fight still worked out to be roughly the same and you weren't getting in these weird situations of phasing him early or later than he would have been previously. And so they didn't do that with Jailer, and so I'm wondering how this all works out as to, like I said, the phasings of transitioning between stuff. Whether you'll Are they intending you to skip entire mechanics or entire phases, or are they still trying to make you play all the stuff out, just make it so that you don't have to optimize DPS as much at the end? I don't know. It's hard to tell.
Yeah, I mean, it's a unique situation for sure. It's not many times that a guild of our level would be able to go in Tuesday and kind of experience that for ourselves in this manner. Like clan our officer is going to be able to make lots of decisions based on what he sees, and like he can look at some of the kills or that occur earlier in that day, see how they approach if he wants to. He can choose
Hmm.
to not and just kind of experience it blindfolded and make adjustments off of that. I know that we care a lot about making sure that we use our time wisely. So I'm almost certain that he would look at how other guilds are approaching it. We'll obviously have to take into account how many of those were guilds that were frogging and killing it just then versus it's their farm clear, right?
Yep.
I have plenty of farm clears that day. But
Yep.
but they've also made a couple of changes that were, just kinder to the P1 and 2, one of which is one that I actually kind of called in Discord, in our guild Discord, was the domination is now triggered on players with 3 stacks of tyranny instead of 2. So you have to be in 3 lines or be in 2 lines with a line coming out of you as well to actually get MC'd. I know that this is a really, really big point of contention for guilds. Ours especially, I prog with a second guild, Infernum and Hyjal. They've also really struggled with it, specifically right around it's about like 140 into the fight when you have a ranged group off to the side. You got a big melee group plus the extra range that aren't in that shortened range group. You're all kind of packed together. Some groups are better at like making a perfect line out of it. Some groups are kind of all clumped because you've also got the martyrdom, the tank slam that follows that very, very shortly. It was all pretty hectic. And I know that point in the fight, really, really common for people to get MC'd. Also, the transition from phase 1 to 2, that's very much more caused by greed of individual players. Like you
Yes.
could choose to be in a much safer spot. Some people choose not to be, and they put themselves in a crummy situation. But now, I wonder how many people are going to try to greed more in that transition from phase 1 to 2, knowing that they can be safer with these lines.
Yeah, I sure hope they don't try to greed because with all the health and the damage buffs and things like that, you definitely don't need to greed at all anymore. Take it as safe as possible and it will get you across the finish line. So I hope I hope people understand that. But yeah, I'm not really a fan of some of the mechanics of how the jailer worked out, where they need you to all be stacked, but then also not be stacked too much because the tank slam is coming, but then also be completely spread out because you're having to deal with lines, and the lines are definitely harder on melee because they're in like the center where like more lines are crossing and stuff like that. So I'm kind of just not a fan of how the mechanics on this fight work out. It doesn't feel as much of a dance to me as it did initially or as it seemed on video. It seems almost more like a hope you get lucky where the wrong people don't have the wrong mechanics at the wrong time and like everybody just has enough room around them where they can uh spread out and get through it, but it doesn't seem like there's a 100% consistent way where nobody's ever going to ever have any problems kind of. It's like if the wrong 3 people or 5 people all get the wrong exact lines, like a person is just completely trapped and there's nothing you can do and things like that. Which there is always something you can do, but at the same time, I feel like it's asking too much on this fight and too early in the fight also. Um,
Yeah, that's true.
so I'm sort of just not a fan of how these mechanics work out. I think the next change of reducing the knockback and things like that will help a lot also with people being able to be in position or get to a new position uh, in time and things like that without having to worry about the torments on the ground, things like that. So
Yeah,
I think
and
these changes are good, but I kind of wish the mechanics were either just timed differently or designed differently in the first place. But
yeah, and it's
I don't know.
it's it's just so incredibly easy in early progression for someone to get mind controlled, and then they're just out of the fight, right? And when you're a guild that's prognant, you're gonna have, I think uh, deaths related to healers needing to adjust to certain aspects of the fight. Like there's gonna be lots of things that are killing you, and to just kind of throw this on top kind of sucks. I know that there were multiple different approaches that could have been taken to this particular MC. I think when you're this early in the fight on a end boss, losing one person just kind of ends it entirely. But there was the thought of I've seen a couple of different thoughts on how it could have been handled differently. Was if when you get MC'd, you treat it like P2 and you just kind of do a slow walk to the edge until your shield is broken.
Yeah, and like the person could be broken out and not just die entirely. Yeah.
But it's you still feel it because you're taking away from your boss damage, so it doesn't feel like a clean pull, but it still
Mhm.
like hinders you in some way that's meaningful, right? Because you're also about to have mechanics that occur right after that, so there's still like some level of transition in your thinking. I thought that was a cool idea. I think another idea that would have worked well is take damage based on the number of lines that you're in, and so it was at least manageable to an extent. Kind of the way with the bombs right now, right? So like one of the other changes they made, I guess I'll kind of skip down a little bit, is the bombs are going to be doing less damage. So like if you have two people that don't go into their bomb soak or whatever, your group was originally pretty much dead, or at least a lot of players would have been, right? Two people just didn't make it in their hole; they exploded on the group.
Right.
Now, you could probably do that and still live. So I think that they could have easily tuned the damage of this idea of like an MC line doing damage to you to make it somewhat reasonable. It was also one of those things where, if you were a good player that could afford to dedicate a cooldown there as well, that you could at least continue the fight to some extent. So I don't know. I feel like
Yeah.
there were a lot of ways they could have handled this boss differently. Although I very
I
much. Go ahead.
I was gonna say also like I think it's good to reward players where if they're able to do, for example, all of P1 safely and correctly, where they get the bombs in the holes, they do all the soaks and everything else, then they can kind of save their defensive and get rewarded by being able to give themselves like a little bit more, not necessarily a grace period, but like a little bit of room for error, a margin for error on making a mistake on a later mechanic if they play the earlier mechanics properly and they don't have to use their defensive there or something like that. I think Blizzard in the future, when designing fights, should take more thought and consideration in how one person's mistake can affect the other people, because there's definitely bosses where losing one person isn't immediately fight ending, even on an end boss. Like I think Sylve, like if a person died to Rive, um, for one, it's like that mechanic was timed, I think, pretty close to when you were getting a B res or a second B res in the fight, so you could res them pretty reliably. And P2 had a little bit of a downtime where that was like a safe time to do it, also. But you could do P2 both sides of the platforms with one person dead if you like still did the rest of it perfectly and cleanly and everybody used their cooldowns properly and things like that. But you could still get further in the fight. And you could do P3 with one person dead. Whereas like Jailer or Halandris or something like that, where one of the bomb people on Halandris explodes, it just either instantly kills the other 19 people in the raid, or because you don't have the damage to do the MCs, or you don't have a person to get the line to Azeroth or things like that, that it's so much harder to progress in a fight like that, where I feel like one person's mistake shouldn't immediately cancel out the other 19 people's ability to at least see the fight and practice it or progress later in the fight a little bit. Like I feel like that's a bit too harsh for a mechanic, unless it's like very clearly the one singular focus of the boss. Like if Laundress only had bombs and didn't have any of the rotating, lasers, or didn't have any of the motes going into the boss that you had to play soccer with, or any, like, if it was just bombs, maybe it's okay as like a one gimmicky thing, but I don't know. I feel like the fights are they're too pass fail binary checks a lot of the time on one person rather than being the group as a whole.
Yeah, so I mean, another quick anecdote is dire progression, right? You had the kicks on the arguably melee side.
Yep.
Um, that was a good example of a pass fail mechanic because it was one in which if someone individually was not performing, that they did not have to partake in it. That you could have your better players handle the mechanic to ensure that it was done, and if one of the better players wasn't playing well that day or whatever, that could be adjusted as well. That there could be hero plays where somebody last second calls out that they don't have their kick and somebody else could. Like, just a very different style of pass fail.
You had like 8 or 10 people handling a mechanic that only needed like 5 people, right? So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yep.
that little bit of margin for error is kind of built in. Yeah, I like that a lot better personally. But
Well, back to the jailer then. So like, there's a couple I'll just cover really, really quickly that I don't think that there's too much to talk about, right? So like the damage done by you doing the soak is reduced. Cool, good idea. The damage done by bombs we touched on earlier. Cool, good idea. Maybe you can have less people make into a hole and still be able to progress, which I think is the perfect approach, like we just discussed. The amount of damage needed. Oh, that's unheroic for Rune of Compulsion Absorb. But looking at the knockback, I think that in and of itself is going to be really interesting because the knock, when you are progressing a phase for the first time, is when you aren't as prepared for the knock, I would say. Like,
mm-hmm.
even if somebody's calling it out, you know that it's coming, you're looking for it, arguably, you might still get knocked in a hole, or at least that's what I've seen, because the more and more we've pulled P2, the less and less people have been knocked in a hole.
Right.
But in P4 or in P3, when we see it, entirely reasonable that someone would get knocked in a hole just because they're not incredibly used to it yet or focused on it, right? Now that it's not even going to knock, there's actually some situations where that could cause some players to die, like the overlap with torments and the knock. Some people might instinctively stay in their torment and just take the damage from it instead of get knocked out of it in P2.
I hope that's like a 1 or 2 time mistake and then you learn pretty quick. But yeah,
I
I can definitely see that happening.
I agree. I think it'll be funny because Clan just won't call out that there's an overlap at all, and then maybe
Yep.
people just adjust, right? So what else did they change?
I
They
also I think with the knockback is it's one thing to me where the knockback is maybe always consistent, or at least like you can bait it to be consistent, like you do in P3 with the ranged group and things like that. Something that I don't know, I found more not necessarily frustrating, but just kind of annoying, and it made the fight kind of needlessly harder than it should need to be, I feel like, was that in P2, especially the knockbacks weren't in a consistent place. He has like 3, maybe 4 different locations where the knock can be, and you have to learn how to handle all 4 of them at once, kind of, because you don't know which one it's going to be, and you don't have enough time to react to like completely change your positioning because you also need to do like the soaks right after and things like that. And so I think there's also a big difference in if you have a mechanic like that that's going to knock people, like have some more consistent way to know where it's going to be knocking you, in what direction and what, uh, you know, how to handle it and things like that. So,
yeah, I think a portion of that is obvious because it targets range, right? Because there have been
mhm.
times. There was actually one time where I went into melee as targeted, put the
Mm.
knockback in melee, like a very unique spot. So I think the portion of that is strategy to handle the boss, but like you can't expect a demo lock that's out there sending into their tyrant to move, right? To make it a more consistent position. So I agree with you that like there could have been a different approach to knock
Well, and
entirely.
it's a knock-on effect from like the earlier stuff. So like you have I think 6 different bomb positions that you could get, but kind of 7 because you also might not get a bomb at all. So like there's kind of 7 different positions in the room that you might go into P2 with, and then of those 7 positions, there's also the lines, which can be in like however many 20 like factorial different combinations of the lines. And so then depending on how the lines are and how you have to move with the lines around you so that you aren't getting hit by two of those, then you end up in a different position. So it's like the position of the ranged going into P2 and having those knockbacks is almost never going to be 100% consistent, basically, because of the mechanics that you already had previously. Whereas if those mechanics were more consistent or had fewer permutations or whatever, then you could at least say like the knock is going to be in only one of these four locations always, and like you can at least plan around them a bit better. I don't know.
Yeah, and I know that it's about area denial, but it would not have been that if they had made them centered on Azeroth that always got
Yeah,
knocked
I
away
feel
from
like that would have been fine. Yeah. Something like that. Yeah.
that.
But
Just
I think these changes are still good and they will still help a lot. But I think if they wanted to think about how their fights are designed going forward so that they don't have to possibly do these weird nerfs and like come up with them out of the blue, I think a different philosophical way of designing and thinking about the boss and how people will experience the boss as players is a better way of doing it.
yeah. I will say though, like seeing a lot of the nerfs that have come to all of these bosses, I did enjoy portions of fights that I got to pull that were unnerfed, right? Not
Hmm.
not entirely to the level obviously of anything similar to Race to World first kind of pull of the boss. But it was cool to at least experience that, see the differences, just because they nerf these bosses so heavily, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Well, that's kind of what I'm saying. Is I feel like the like race to world first version of the boss is like how the boss was like meant to be experienced in like the design perspective. And then also normally like the first or maybe first and second round of nerfs are kind of like they also plan for those in advance. Like I think the Sire nerf, like maybe that wasn't planned, but the way they did it, like I said, where they changed the phase transition points in his health and things like that, that felt like a way where they still had maybe planned that in advance of like this is the nerf we're going to do. How is it going to best affect people? Whereas that's what I'm saying with these jailer nerfs is I think some of the earlier nerfs felt planned from the outset, kind of these are the things we're going to nerf on the boss. And then at this point, they've run out of those ideas and they still need to nerf the boss a lot more. And so they're kind of having to come up with brand new stuff out of thin air to change the boss that they're kind of scrambling and just kind of picking whatever jumps out uh,
yeah,
as the nerfs that they have to do. It's not really a cohesive design goal, I feel like.
I don't know how much fault them for that too, just because that shorter already, like shorter than the normal. Got bosses that were untested too. I think a lot of people forget that aspect too, that these bosses came live untested. Not that they could not have
Definitely true.
adjusted them more, but I think it's something that following this tier, I would be shocked if Blizzard returned to that point of testing less bosses. I definitely agree with the concept of not testing a P4 to an end boss, something like that. I
A
think that's a
mythic end boss
really,
phase, yeah.
really cool aspect of it. You'll see a lot of
Mhm.
different permutations of how guilds handle that potentially. Maybe if one guild's so far ahead that you just only see one example, but I just like the concept of some portion of the tier that you just can't know about, can't plan for that type of thing until it's but four or three bosses is too much. Too much we've shown. It was a good test. I'm glad that they did it. I'm very hopeful that they won't again.
Interesting. That was going to be a question I had actually. I I don't feel nearly as negative on it, I would say, because I feel like the bosses that were untested, Calandris had testing and then got changed, and the version that we got didn't have testing. Um,
Yeah.
but I felt like Calandris was great. One of my favorite bosses of all time, actually, especially in the initial version. I don't like the nerfed version as much, just to put that out there very clearly. But and I felt like Lords was good. I think Raglan is pretty well liked among most people that have done prog on it and things like that. I didn't do prog on it myself, but on Mythic at least. Anduin I wasn't a fan of. Jailer I wasn't a fan of, but I think I always wasn't going to like Jailer specifically, just the way that they've designed the fight, with the line of sight mechanics and all the knockbacks and all that type of thing, um, and falling in holes in the floor, especially. And Anduin was okay, I would say. He wasn't atrociously bad, but he had a few, like I said, kind of binary mechanics that I felt like made the fight weaker than it could have been. But overall, I felt like the experiment worked out pretty well. That the bosses weren't that buggy. They functioned, seemed like pretty much properly how they were intended to, and the fights were pretty fun. So overall, I wouldn't say it was a failure, and I don't want them to do it again. But I think, like I said, I maybe want them to maybe change their philosophy on how they're designing some of the bosses, especially maybe an end boss that isn't being tested at all prior to releasing.
Yeah,
Especially because maybe it's just too hard for people if they don't have the prior uh, experience with it, or especially also I think the loot not being an incentive to do it on heroic also was like a compounding factor. So yeah, I
I
think maybe specifically for end bosses they should adjust how they design end bosses if they're going to not do testing, or they should just make sure that the end boss, because it's kind of like the most important, maybe they should test that one, but they can hold off on maybe testing some of the medium to late bosses, or something. I don't know.
yeah, I mean, so you're right. You're very right to include Halandris in that. Definitely something I should have included in that number. And I think you're right that they nailed it on Halandris, and I wasn't progressing it watching you guys pull it, like just knowing full well that was a good fight. Didn't get to experience it before the 10-second bombs, but very much a good fight, right? I did get to experience Raglan, and from a healing perspective, that was a banger fight. I love that one. Perfect. Did a very good approach to it altogether. I don't know how I felt about Lords of Dread. I felt like there definitely could have been some changes. The change that they made where you were no longer stunned when it was passed, I think was a really good one, because that just really wasn't fun to play around. Then I think there were a lot of things that went wrong with Jailer, right, specifically. So I think you're right that they do have the chance to make a really good boss. I just don't know if it's something that I personally would want to give up the chance of not seeing those bosses ahead of time, knowing full well that it's kind of a 50-50 as to whether or not the boss is going to come out a way that the community or us as individual players would enjoy.
I will say, so for one thing, like the Lords of Dread, the AoE damage increase, it should have just been universal from the start. That's my
Yeah,
one
that
kind of
was, yeah,
nitpick
I
thing.
don't.
But I also, it's kind of like I can see from a mile away that that was a planned nerf that they were going to make, like inevitably, and I called that like a month in advance or
Yeah.
something. So at the same time, like I wasn't too upset with it because I knew it would be changed probably by the time we got to that boss anyway. Um, I will say, for end bosses especially, I would rather test them and make sure that they're fun and like not going to be a repeat of Jailer where this tier is cut short and they have to like nerf the boss to basically be not the same boss. Like I would rather experience the boss as close to the world first guild and have that be tested beforehand and make sure it's tuned correctly for them and for the rest of the player base and things like that are CE guilds and things like. I would rather test the boss and get to that point rather than have a repeat of Jailer where it feels like I'm not even fighting the same boss anymore. So, I if that's the two choices, I'm definitely taking test the boss. But hopefully, I think they can find a middle ground in between. But if that's not possible, I'll take the old way definitely for sure.
Yeah, definitely keep my eyes peeled to see how they're approaching Dragonflight and whatnot. Or maybe even if they're gonna do any form of testing for the affixes they're gonna put out. I'd be shocked if they did personally, but maybe they will.
For
Who
season
knows?
four, you mean the
Yeah,
faded
yeah, yeah, for season
affixes?
4, the faded affixes.
You think they're
Which,
not going to test them at all?
um, I don't know. I don't feel like implementing affixes to a fight warrants testing it, but I could be wrong. I mean, I'd much rather they come out bug free. Obviously, I just don't think that there would be too much of an issue with them because they know it's a shortened season. They aren't putting that much effort into it for them to just release it and then a week in, if it's really that troublesome, make the change. So
Maybe. Part of me is wondering if after they start season 4, if they're entirely focused on Dragonflight at that point, and there's basically no more changes going to happen. So that's one concern. My other concern is even if they wanted to test it, they don't have much time left in the first place. So, hmm,
Yeah.
I guess they might not.
Yeah, they
I
might
hadn't really
not.
thought of that until then.
Well, I know that we also touched on kind of race to first approach, or like seeing the bosses manner.
Hmm.
And this tier, it was just so noticeable how they tuned around that. That it felt for a long time like we were experiencing a world first boss, one that was at least a bit tougher. Um,
Hmm.
our guild was unique in that we were very close to killing a lot of the bosses before and then they got nerfed, and then we just kind of they toppled over. Right. Best example was Halandris. We were seeing, what was that, second transition. We were
We
like
had gotten
just
into P3 a couple times when the nerf
y-
came in.
yeah, like with
Like not solidly into P3, like planted in the room yet, but like
right.
starting P3 and then it falls apart in the first like 10 seconds. But I still count it.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think it was very cool to experience that. I think that they have to be really, really careful with this concept of tuning around that because, the player base is, uh, rats in a rat race, essentially. Like, we're playing the game to get gear for some form of progression, playing it for enjoyment. I know that people get enjoyment out of a tough boss, but
Hmm.
there's a large portion of the player base that if they can't do something, they just stop doing it. That's just like the separation of people in general, right? Like, um, I, my point being that I think they need to be careful with how they tune it. I think that a lot of the changes that they made could have been made a little bit earlier. That would help ease the player base into this because, just looking at the nerfs that I'm showing right now, these nerfs are great. Guilds that are progressing Jailer will very much kill it. Like, I think if you are just about to do, you have a almost certain shot of killing it in the remaining month that we have, right? We've got 4 weeks of lockouts from when this video is going to be released, pretty much.
Hmm.
Um, you've
I
got
think even P1, I think any guild that's on Jailer or like very close to killing uh whichever one they're on of Lords and Regalon, I'm assuming Regalon, but maybe they did the opposite order for some reason. If you're like more than halfway into Raglan, you can probably kill Jailer and get CE this tier, I think, now, after these nerfs.
yeah, that's safe to assume.
It might be pretty close if you're only raiding like 6 hours a week or something, but I think it's still doable.
I will say though, Rio, because I know that you didn't watch too much of our Regalon prog. They did make the change that's not included here, where there's basically an extra puddle on the
Hmm.
ground, and that was an issue that we had. Was we had quite a few wipes to somebody picking up an extra
Right.
puddle, and then it
Again,
was
there
just
was
over.
no single margin for error, even for one person,
Yeah,
before that change. So yeah.
yeah, it, yeah. There's a lot to it, but I personally think that if a guild were progressing Lords of Dread, like just because that's such a short progression, that they might have a shot at it. Like if you played well and whatnot.
Mm.
I think if you did your research for Jailer ahead of time, maybe if you spoke with some guilds that had killed it and you really put in the effort, I think that you very much could. I think if you're on Anduin, it might be a lost cause. It's tough to really argue one way or another. But I will say that a lot of guilds are really really feeling this tuning, and it'll be interesting to see Blizzard's reaction in Dragonflight. Do they really approach it from that same perspective of making the fights just entirely different bosses for Race to World First versus the guilds that are getting a CE at the end of the tier, like this Race to World Last, essentially?
Right. I this is a little bit of my own whatever, maybe bias or just weird framing of stuff, but I don't think they tuned these bosses for the Race to World First. I think they tuned them for double legendary and four sets. And I think that's an important distinction to make because I feel like they set themselves up for this problem by giving us these huge power gains in this patch, and they didn't want to just give it to us at the start. They wanted it to be a little bit of a progression, because it's weird if you just I log in Tuesday and I'm doing 20% more damage. Like, it's weird feeling if you just had double legendary for some reason, or you had your 4 set immediately. Um, so they like that it's a slow, more gradual process. I think the same is true with the boss nerfs also, where I would prefer, instead of having gone from 10 seconds to 30 seconds on Halandras bombs, if it had gone from 10 to 16 and then from 16 to like 22 and then from 22 to 30 or something like that. Um, and they did it in a more gradual process rather than overnight. The boss doesn't feel like a boss anymore. Like,
Yep, yep.
I feel like it's very jarring for a player, and it doesn't feel satisfying anymore. Whereas like 10 to 16, it's like you feel like you're still playing a very similar mechanic. Like, maybe it's not the exact same numerically, but it's at least in the same vein, in the same spirit. Whereas 10 to 30, it's like the mechanic doesn't exist almost anymore in my mind, like playing the fight. Whereas
Listeners.
previously it was at the forefront of your mind the whole time. And so that's a very weird difference. Um, but
Yep.
going back to it, I think the problem was they didn't want, because if they tuned the raid where you have one legendary and no set bonuses, as soon as you get them, the difficulty is completely invalidated. It'd be like Emerald Nightmare again, which was a tier that lasted like 18 hours for Race to Worlds First for the end boss at the time, in Legion, and they don't want that to happen. So they don't want the difficulty to be invalidated, and so they kind of put themselves in this corner where the only way for the difficulty to stay existing was for them to tune around the power level that we would eventually get to and then tune around that. So I feel like that was almost more the problem, because I think this, as like a talking point, has come up uh more recently, where especially I think in Shadowlands, where people say that the raids are tuned around Race to Worlds First, and I don't really think that's true, because, for example, Sire or Sylvanas or something, like, there is probably 300 plus guilds, probably closer to like maybe 500, that killed those bosses in the same exact tuning numbers wise of the fight. Like, the fights didn't get nerfed, as the Race to World First people did. Now, the people that killed it, in 3 to 500 range, they had more gear at that point, obviously, and they might have had more soul binds or something at the start of Shadowlands. But I think that's a little bit different than nerfing the boss mechanically, especially if you just nerf the HP and you take off 5% HP. Like, that's still the same boss, but when you're changing the mechanics of the fight, that's when it feels like it's not the same boss anymore to me. And so that's where I
Yeah.
feel like I don't really like those changes, and I don't think they should be necessary most of the time. If
Yeah.
you need to nerf a boss more than like 10% of their HP, I feel like something went wrong. And it wasn't the tuning. It was like the design of the fight, or and allowing a margin for error for like one person or something for the rest of the 19 people to still progress, or something else went wrong in terms of like the patch of like the power progression and the power curve and things like that. So I feel like this is a weird thing, and it also I'll lead into this. People tie in weak auras into this too, where they think weak auras are causing them to have to make the fights harder to tune around Race to World First, because Race to World First uses weak auras to help with a lot of stuff. But I know for me personally, I use very minimal weak auras. Oftentimes, I get the weak aura pack that our raid team says everybody needs to get, and I probably don't even necessarily actively look at or pay attention to like 80% of the cores in the pack. Like, there's one or two for certain mechanics that I think are helpful, but for the most part, just kind of playing the fight and understanding the timers of the fight and stuff like that is just kind of how I learn the fight, how I've always learned fights, and how I've just gotten used to that, and I don't really feel the need for weak cores to help me a lot of the time. But yeah, so
Okay.
I don't feel
Well,
like weak cores are a big factor, but the the lower down I feel like you go in the community, like past CE level, people that aren't getting CE or maybe just barely getting AOTC or something, for them it feels like weak auras are a bigger factor somehow, when I feel like as the higher up you go, the less true that is, which is a weird inverse relationship thing there. I'm just curious as your thoughts on that.
wait, can you say the last part again about the? So you're saying that the higher
The
up you
the
go,
perception, at least, of how important weak auras are.
well, I think it's very important to for me to state that I don't know if I've really fully formed my position on the topic. I think saying that up front is important because the only thing I have are anecdotes off the top of my head right now, right? And I should make it clear to people that I play with a um, very heavily edited UI around WeakWords. It's very unique, in which I try to use my peripheral vision to see what is available to me, like the tools that I have at hand through colors. It's a very weird thing, hard to explain.
Yeah, I was gonna
Maybe,
say I also have a very old school UI. Like if you plugged my UI into Wrath of the Lich King era UIs, it's not that different
yeah,
from then
that's
because that's
true.
when I started rating and things like that, and it's pretty much the same where I still have my action bars on the bottom, and I just have my player frames somewhat near the middle and my target frame somewhat near the middle, and that's kind of it. And I get by with that. So yeah, I
You know
also have a
what?
bit of a unique perspective on that. So
Let's do that. Let's take the break test. We have an application test essentially to see if people pass, where we ask for their UI in raid combat specifically, and a lot of people send it to us outside of combat or outside of a raid or whatever, what have you, right? We want to see like you got boss timers, all those little things, right?
mhm.
Let's Rio, you and I, let's post our UIs in the description just so that people can
Sure.
see. But my point about the weak war is I do want to hear your thought. How do you think Jailer would be approached E1 with bombs if you didn't have a weak aura telling you which bomb hole to go in?
Yeah, there is definitely some mechanics that I feel like you almost need a weak aura to solve, and I don't like those a lot of the time. I think another good example was the Lehuvum group splitting into 4 or 5 groups or whatever for the, the different resonances. I forget exactly what the mechanic was called,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
the push and pull things. Yeah. Um, Stuff like that where it feels I think there was an intended way to handle that without a weak aura, but it's like the gap between the intended way that you would do it without a weak aura takes so much more time and is so much more effort and is so much more distracting for the person that's doing it or the multiple people that have to do it. Like maybe in some cases everyone in the raid has to figure it out like on the fly. Whereas the gap between doing that and just solving it with the weak aura is too big, and so it feels like the weak aura is just the only real solution. And I don't like when that's the case. I definitely like when I would prefer if a mechanic was either entirely or like more than viable to just deal with it on the fly. And if that was almost as good as doing it with a Weakora. Like maybe a Weakora makes it 10% more consistent or whatever, but if your players are just paying attention and you can figure it out enough that it works out. But
I agree.
so
Yeah,
I do agree that that is a problem on some fights, but I think that those are the exception, not the rule, if that makes sense. Like those are
yeah.
the rare like singular mechanics on certain fights where that's the case. But most of the time, a weak aura is it's similar to like just deadly boss mods or big wigs or whatever. It's just for me, it's similar to just a boss timer where it just lets me know that this is the next thing coming and it's going to be happening in roughly 10 seconds from now, and that's it. And then it doesn't really once the mechanic comes, you just deal with the mechanic as anybody else. Like whether you had the weak aura or not, you're still reacting to the mechanic and dealing with it in the same way. Whereas the weak auras that change how you react to the mechanic, I feel like, are a separate kind of distinct problem. And I think those do sometimes go too far. But I think Blizzard has done a pretty good job of reining it in when those pop up, or changing the design of the fights when that's the case also. So I feel like weak auras are I think they're a overemphasized issue for the actual amount of issues they actually cause in practice, kind of. I think they're a bigger community talking point, especially from like I said, kind of the more casual player base that probably isn't playing at CE guilds and raids and things like that. I feel like the outside perception of it, because they see it, it's supposed to be a noticeable thing. It's so noticeable when you're watching a stream or something like that that you're seeing all these weak auras, and so I feel like it's such a jarring um, disparity between what they experience and what they're seeing. The Race to World First people have, and it feels like they're playing a different game. When in reality, like probably the people playing Race to World First are also probably ignoring half of their requests, but I
Hmm.
don't know.
Yeah. I I'm interested most in if they make changes based off of that community perception going into Dragonflight. Because it does, while I'm newer to the scene, it does feel like this discussion of weak auras has more recently sparked up
Mm.
in this last, I want to say, 2 tiers, it seems to
I
be. But
will I
yeah.
will also say it seems people have the perception that raids have gotten harder over time, and I think that's true. I think Sepulcher, it's obviously true. Like this is probably the hardest raid of all time. On release, it was at least. Probably not now, but given the shortened length of the season and stuff like that, it probably still is. Maybe I don't know. There's like one or two in the past that are maybe in the discussion, but it's at least up there. And so, ignoring Sepulcher though, I think Castle Nathria and Sanctum, they didn't feel significantly harder to me than any of the Legion raids that I was doing, um, if at all. Like some of them maybe even felt easier than some of the Legion raids that I was doing back then. So to me, I don't feel like raids have gotten harder. Um, if they have, it's only to the extent that they're keeping up with the player base getting better over time
That's true.
and just
Yeah.
a little bit. But I don't think it's been like a radical thing where it's like if you were a mythic raider before, it's like it's impossible for you to mythic raid now because they're so much harder and you haven't kept up and you took a break from the game. Like I came back from the game, I hadn't played it in like a couple of years, and I jumped back in and I'm perfectly fine. You know, like to me, I don't notice much of a difference.
I
So I don't know.
I will say, as a quick anecdote, I'm a little hesitant on when players return saying, back in, you know, X expansion, I was top US, whatever, and,
Uh,
you end up trying them and they are just
I
gosh
I
awful. But
I think that that skepticism is properly and correctly had.
yeah,
I I have share your also uh
yeah,
iffy feelings on those a lot of times.
yeah. But it's a good transition because you started to talk about other tiers into this concept of. Here, I'll transition the page as well over to this kind of time frame. I know that you wanted to talk a little bit about where, if you take a quick look at these charts, it was a post in the competitive WoW Reddit, which we'll have linked below, and you'll kind of see that it shows a breakdown of if you're a 2, 3, 4 night guild, how many hours that you've had on these fights compared to when the World First Guild first killed, like the amount of prog time that they spent, and how unique it is this tier. So Ria, I'll kind of let you take it from there.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the easiest way to look at it is just comparing the 2 and 3 to the world's first time. I think 4 net guilds are kind of the exception. 2 net guilds are also kind of the exception. I think 3 is kind of the average standard that you would expect. But even for 2, for Nathria and Sanctum, like it's roughly double, if not more, for the amount of time that a 2 net guild has worse for compared to the world's first guild. And oftentimes the biggest factor in how far you're progressing isn't the difficulty of the fights themselves, it's just the amount of hours you have had in the raid. So a good example is Sanctum of Domination or something, where the first week you go into Mythic, you might only kill the first 2 bosses, or maybe the first 3 bosses. But in your first week of gear, like your raid team was probably capable of killing Remnant and Soul Render at the same time. It's just they didn't have enough hours in the week to get up to those bosses and progress through those bosses. Like those bosses might be 100 pulls at the time when you're having that level of gear, and so it might take, you know, 10 to 15 hours progging that boss or something. I don't know. I'm just kind of throwing out numbers, making them up out of thin air. Don't think about that too much. But anyway, 10 to 15 hours to prog those bosses, but when you're only raiding 9 hours a week, it's like you don't even have the chance to get to that boss in the first place, let alone to do the 10 to 15 hours of prog on the boss. Even though you're technically capable of killing it, like it's not the skill level difference of the world first guild that's allowing them to kill those bosses the first week versus say an average CE guild. The difference is the raid hours. So then the week 2 they go in and they kill, instead of the first 2 or 3 bosses, now they get up to the 4th boss, and maybe they're fourth and a half, like they're halfway into progging the 5th boss or something like that. And then the 3rd week they get up to killing 5 bosses, and it goes from there. But the biggest factor is the time difference. It's not really the skill gap between players. The skill gap is not that big between world first raiders and CE players. I would say if you're in like a top 200 world guild, chances are you're about equal in skill level. I can say this from experience, about equal in skill level to the world first players. The difference is the time you're putting in to your raid each week. But oftentimes the best people, like in logs and things like that, for DPS especially, the best people that are getting the most consistent highest parses and things like that on fights aren't in the world's first guilds. They're in these 200 world 200 ranked guilds or whatever. And so those are like the actual best players on each individual spec, but they're not in the world first guild team, and so they're not getting the world first, even though they're like the actual, best survival hunter main in the world isn't in Echo or Liquid. They're probably in some random seat guild in the world 200 range, but and they're a dedicated survival main that's been playing it every tier. And so the difference isn't really the skill level gap between a world first guild and a CE guild. The difference is the amount of raid hours you have had in the raid to in terms of like how far you will have progressed and gotten in the raid and things like that. So I think this chart, then when you compare it to Sepulcher, you can see most of the time a CE guild or whatever is going to have had, because most of the 2 night guilds and 3 night guilds and things like that, like most of those guilds didn't spend those full 200-ish plus hours to get CE. Like most of them got CE a fair bit before the end of the tier, right? So this is taking the entire tier length of time in total, the amount of weeks and things like that. You have that in the lower chart where it has 28 and 32 weeks. Most of those guilds probably got CE around week, say 20 or 16 to 24, somewhere in that range. And so also those guilds didn't spend the full 200 2 times hours. Like they maybe spent 1.5 times the amount of hours in the raid as the world first guild or something. And keep in mind that they also got a gear bonus and things like that, item level, which helps them compared to the world first guild at the same time. So sometimes the pull counts go slightly up, but then also nerfs start happening, which averages it back down a little bit. So it all kind of evens out in the end. There's a lot of noise in between, depending on the level that you're rating at and things like that, of course. But comparing it to Sepulcher, even if you were the same exact players of Race to World First, if you're in a 2 night guild, it's like you wouldn't have possibly had enough hours in the tier to progress at the same rate that the World First Guild did. You would have had to progress almost twice as fast as the World First Guild progressed on these bosses, which basically equates out to like half the prog time on each boss, which is almost half the pulls, but not quite because of pulls being weird. But anyway, it's like imagine if instead of Echo spending 300 pulls on Halandris, you spent 150, and you did it for every single hard boss that they faced in Race to World First. Like, it's not reasonable to ever expect a 2 night guild to do that. And same for a 3 night guild and a 4 night guild. Like, the difference is that this tier being shortened and only having 20 weeks, they just physically have not had enough raid hours to progress on the fights. And that's the bigger problem, more than the difficulty of the fights themselves. The fights being hard obviously didn't help. And not having loot incentives to kill Jailer and stuff obviously didn't help. And not having the item level increase and 2 legendaries and tier set bonuses over the Race to World First guilds, like all that stuff didn't help. Whereas in Sanctum you had like rank 5 shard sets and stuff. But the hours is like the biggest factor by far, and most of the guilds, CE guilds, if you give them the same amount of hours or more, they can clear the raid. But if you don't give them the hours in the first place, it doesn't matter what their gear is because they won't even have gotten the chance to get far enough to like see the boss, to experience it and have that gear come into play and matter. So it's like the power level isn't even the factor. I feel like it's the hours that matters most. So that's kind of my big spiel and
Okay,
rant on this.
there's a lot to address, obviously. I'm interested though, when you say world first guilds, are you referencing, you know, because that's a very generic response, and that will obviously alter my own response to your comments. So, would you say when you say to you would you say to the world first guild, or are you
I would
saying
say
to like
any guild in like top 5, top 10 range
okay,
in the world at least. They're all kind of in the same ballpark area.
all right, so interesting. I think I have a fairly different take. I agree very much on the point that um the amount of hours does certainly play into it to some degree, right? I think that there are ways that that is altered via here. I think Sepulcher was a unique scenario where you know the I think the eye level of the guilds that were killing it, like first top 10 or whatever, were pretty close to that where a lot of guilds are now progressing it. Just
Mm-hmm.
because there was so much time before it was actually guilded. There were vaults, there were multiple characters that kind of covers the eye level gap, I would say.
Well, and also they could turn higher item levels stuff into tier at the same time. So it wasn't like you
yeah.
got a higher item level piece, but you got tier in a slot so that you couldn't use that piece. It's like they could use all of the highest item level pieces they got basically because they could turn them into tier at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I do think there are a lot of little anecdotes about what you said though. So I think the first one would be about the arguable skill gap. And I hear you about, like the differences between world first. I can't speak on it obviously because I've never rated it any level higher than I'm currently at. I'm
There
very
is
much
definitely a skill difference, I will say, but like it's not nearly as drastic as I think people commonly think it is. Maybe that's a better way to phrase what I was trying to
I
say.
I agree with you to a certain extent where I would say it's hard to pick whatever that buffer would be. But maybe it's the top world 50 guilds where I say that the difference between players of our caliber and at their ranking is very, very different. But I think that as that starts to fall, you'll see differences for sure, but that people could make those leaps. So a good example is when you look at a lot of the world first guilds, they are developed of players that were once at this ranking. But I think you something to consider is we've had people from Break that have gone to higher guilds. They were very much like the best players of Break when they were taken.
I was gonna
And
say the difference is kind of in a guild like Break. It's like you take maybe the top 5 or top 3 players in Break, and those are the people that go to those higher guilds. It's not the entire guild of 20 people. Whereas in the Race to World
yeah,
First guild, like it's the full roster of 20, 25 people, obviously, right? So
yes, yes. So
yeah,
this all needs to be considered for sure. The other thing is when those people leave our guild when they were at the very, very top, kind of thinking of like when you're transitioning from middle school to high school in America or something like
okay.
that, right? So like you're the top dog in eighth grade or whatever is the typical thought, and then you go to ninth grade and you're at the bottom of the totem pole. I don't think that a lot of the people that are taken from the guilds of our ranking then are immediately at the top of those 30 or like US or I'm sorry, not US, but like world 50 guilds and above or something like that,
Mm,
right? I
mhm.
think that only the people that are at the top of that totem pole are then even in consideration for the world first guild. So I think that that all should be considered in this equation itself. I do think that fight familiarity and this concept of ours is a great start to it. I do think that there's just so many anecdotes, and it would be really cool to hear this perspective from somebody that has made that leap. And speaking of, if anybody has this experience, please reach out. We'd love to chat with you.
Like I said,
But
I
yeah,
kind of made that leap, but I took that leap and then I took a step back kind of. That's kind of where I'm at. Where I could see I was US 50 ish at the time, which was around World 200 range or 250 maybe. And I could see the gap from me to the World First or like the US or the World Top 50 guilds, and I could see the gap from where I had come from, which was like a mid-level CE guild. I forget what they were at the time, probably like 800, 1,000 range or something. And so I feel like I could see the gaps. I didn't necessarily experience them firsthand though. Like I haven't been in a World Top 50 guild, so like maybe my perception is wrong, but and maybe it's just me being biased and having an ego or whatever, thinking I'm better than I am. But I felt like I could see the gap, and I remember it being not nearly as big as people often talked about. So
yeah, I don't know how much bias or ego would play into anything like that. I will say that it's fairly common though among raiders at any ranking. Like even in our own guild, I think that you a lot of individuals that are so hyper focused on how others are performing rather than themselves. And I think that's probably something that you would not see as much towards a world first guild level. Like that a lot of players know that in order to be a better player that it requires that much more focus on themselves. I'm not saying
I was
that
gonna say, yeah, that's how you get to be that good in the first place is focusing on yourself. Yeah, that's
yeah,
exactly right.
I don't think it's wrong to have an opinion about somebody else's gameplay. Everybody's going to naturally form that the same way that you would form a first opinion of anybody you met in real life, right? Like it's just going to happen. I just think it's important when you're thinking of things to consider all aspects, but not trying to make some deep adjustment in our discussion today. More just kind of like a separate anecdote, I think, about this. But this is a very, very good Reddit link. All things for consideration. I know that there are lots and lots of comments down below, so we're gonna link that in the description for sure. But if you have any closing thoughts on this topic here.
Not really. I just sort of feel a sense of duty or an obligation a little bit to dispel some or debunk some myths that I feel are out there and try and shed some light on, I don't know, the perspectives that I feel like aren't out there and don't get mentioned or talked about very often from people who actually do have a bit more firsthand knowledge of and experience and things like that. That I don't see people, whatever, contesting those ideas very often. So I kind of feel like nobody's else is gonna do it. I have sort of I should be the one to do it
An
just
obligation.
so somebody is. Yeah.
Yep. Well, um, I think that's a perfect point of this podcast is to provide just a different point of view because a lot of the point of views that are taken are from Twitter, from the first guilds, right? So a different point of view entirely. But one point of view I'm interested in hearing from you is what you think now of this announced season 4 date. We know that it is a little bit earlier than I think a lot of the estimates individuals would have going into this unique season. I personally, expected it to come a little bit later. I kind of thought that with how they were handling loot and a number of reasonable reclears and whatnot of these other raids that are now being included in season 4, that it would have made more sense to have more time with this Sepulcher raid, especially with how few guilds have actually cleared CE. It's pretty clear that with these nerfs, they're trying to achieve that in a different manner. But what are your kind of thoughts on when season 4 is coming out?
It's definitely earlier than I expected. I think my predicted date or estimate was August 23rd, so that would have been 3 weeks later than August 2nd, which is what we're getting. I'm almost wondering if we get 2 more weeks from now or something, and there's still not many guilds that have CE. I'm almost wondering if they might delay it if there's not enough CE guilds. Or if there's even more nerfs at that point.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
I feel like they won't want to start a new season and cut off CE. I mean, I think that's also why they're announcing it this early, is so that they are making that cutoff very clear and giving people ample warning ahead of time, so that they're trying to give themselves justifications and reasoning as to why they can do it on the second. But I feel like they don't want to. I feel like they want to get CE numbers up way higher before they do, and that's what these nerfs are trying to do. Like you said, they're just artificially forcing it at this point rather than kind of letting it happen over time as it naturally would. They definitely want to accelerate it and want to get those numbers up, and so I'm wondering if these nerfs will be enough. I'm wondering, yeah, if they might delay it if the numbers aren't enough by a certain point. I don't know how
I
many guilds will get CE by the second. That's basically where I'm at. And so I'm very curious as to what this will end up being once the second finally comes, as to what the numbers will look like.
I would be shocked if they chose to go down the route of extending it the season by any means. I do think that they will look very heavily on that Tuesday and Wednesday to see how many guilds made the leap to CE versus where they were at beforehand.
Hmm.
Um, I would not be surprised if we saw even further nerfs because, like we talked about earlier in the show, there's nothing worse than when you've kind of reached this expectation of what you're capable of, and they tune it a little bit differently than what you were expecting, and it just does not meet your expectations whatsoever. You just feel like the rug is pulled out from underneath you. You kind of had this expectation that you're going to be CE at whatever point in the tier, and then if you're just not reaching that anymore, it's kind of a big blow to a lot of people's egos, which we know are very rampant.
I my other thing is I wonder how they can possibly nerf Jailer further. Like,
Yeah,
what
yeah.
what more can they even do at this point?
What
Do they
more can they
just
do before it
do they just
becomes
knock another 20% health off the boss? Like, I don't even. The fight is already at the point where I'm wondering how the fight functions still with the amount of
yeah.
damage and HP that he has, and I don't know how much. What else they can do? Like, are they just gonna remove mechanics entirely? Are they just going to? Are they just gonna say you can kill the boss? Are they, like, is he just gonna die at 50%? Like, I don't know what's gonna happen anymore. I don't understand how you could possibly nerf it further than the state they already have. So, yeah.
I mean, it's no real answer because any further nerfs has an entire like it could entirely become a fight that is easier than any of the other bosses in the raid necessarily, right? Like
Yeah, at a
that's the
certain point,
level they'd have to
it's
make it.
gonna be easier than Lords and Regalon or Anduin especially, which is that doesn't feel right to me at all. I
Uh,
almost think they should nerf Anduin harder than they're nerfing Jailer at this point. Maybe.
I
Hmm.
agree with that. I agree with that. I think it very much carried the weight of a final boss. It was pretty clear that they smushed two raids together. That this probably was not intended to be a 9.2 end to the season, especially with this like mini season that they've got in between. I Anduin very much felt like a sire or something when
Hmm.
progressing it,
Yes, for sure.
or a Sylve. So I don't know. I think it'll be a very interesting next 4 weeks. I'm very confident in our capability of achieving
Yeah,
CE
I
now.
think we're pretty safe getting CE, but there's a big gap between our guild rank around maybe 400 compared to 800 to 1000 plus, which is kind of the normal CE range that I think they're expecting and that they want to hit. And I feel
Anecdote.
like the lower end of that might struggle maybe.
Yeah. He mentioned world rankings. I was saying those numbers pretty obvious,
Yes,
but just should note that.
good
Um,
clarification.
but yeah, I'm honestly baffled at this tier, this approach to it. I think if you're a developer for the game though, and there's argument that for the devs that this was something that was imposed upon them, like we talked about in the previous episode, where they're expected to grind out an expansion by a certain end date, right? When you're
Hmm.
a developer in that scenario, and that's told to you not too long before necessarily it was announced, like we have no clue how long they knew that this was the case.
Right.
This seems like an entirely reasonable response if they were more recently made aware of this situation. That
Yeah, to me, I think it gives that indication that they weren't made aware of it until in maybe the past month or so, roughly.
it's tough to quantify specifically, right? Like they had to announce that there would be faded
It
raids, and there
feels
was a discussion
fairly
with
it
that. Yeah,
feels fairly recent for the deadline of Dragonflight at least releasing in 2022. It feels like that was a fairly recent locked in decision that now we're having all these knock on effects from to me
yeah,
because
because
they were pretty hands off gradual with the raid nerfs. I feel like until about fairly recently, about a month ago, maybe 2 months, but
well, and
it felt like there was a dramatic uptick urgency in their taking hold of the reins of all right, we got to get these people, to the end point, to the finish line. So,
yeah, kicked or drag them even if they're kicking and screaming. But
yep, exactly.
it's really interesting though. Oh, your mic's buttered, but um, here I'll just mute for 1 second. But it's interesting that we have this lower progression time, that it's a shortened tier, that we have this issue where uh, players aren't achieving CE, and so they're rushing it in this point, almost to meet the expectations they set for themselves with this shortened tier, this faded tier after, where it wouldn't have been entirely unreasonable if we just had a lengthened tier and we had the rest of these. Maybe we had 3 more months or whatever it would have been to just continue progressing Sepulcher, having a prolonged farm period. Because I think that Nyalotha was unique in that way, right? That there was a very, very long time before the
Well,
next patch came out.
yeah, Nyalotha was not unique in that sense. All the end of expansion raids usually have very long farm periods. And I think that's what season 4 was kind of the idea was originally created to solve, was that they didn't like how long those got. But there's one difference from going from very long, like abnormally longer than normal, to the shortest CE raid of all time almost. Like
Arguably, yeah,
there's a
yeah.
middle ground in between where you still have, like you said, the normal length of time for a raid, which at this point it would have been another 1 or 2 more months of season 3 before season 4 came in. Uh, from the August 2 date. So like maybe it should have been September or October almost of when season 4 is happening. And then yeah, you only have maybe 3 or 4 months of season 4, but I think that's a much better balance rather than cutting season 3 short, which is definitely what this feels like. So,
Yeah, I don't know. Like, we'll only be able to judge it after the
in
fact.
retrospect almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can't wait to see it. The one thing that we have judged heavily, that we know that we don't want, or at least in my case, is PI.
Of course.
Seeing the priest tree be released, we'll talk about that on a later date. But more specifically, looking at PI, I am just entirely shocked that they released a tree that involves PI with all of the community backlash around it.
I I really don't understand. I think for some weird reason the devs like the design of PI a lot because they really like the RPG team group dynamic collaboration aspect, cooperation aspect. And like I agree that that's cool. But like there's ways to do it that don't invoke negative feelings in people. And I don't know why they're married to the one version of this idea that comes with negatives. And that's the weirdest thing to me is like there's been proposed alternatives of just make it a flat damage buff. Just make it you do 20% more damage for this duration. And then you can just say 20% of that person's damage in that duration goes back to the priest because that's how it works. And you can do it on logs, you can do it in details, like it'll show up as the priest damage. It's very easy to filter in and out. It's very straightforward. Like just make it a damage buff. And then they're like, "Oh, but haste feels so much more different to play with and things like that." It, at the end of the day, people like doing big numbers. Let me tell you. If people do 20% more damage and their crits are 20% bigger and instead of doing 1 million damage, they're doing 1.2 million damage, they will be happy. Like you're not really taking that much away from them, I feel like, by having them change it from haste to damage. Trust me, I'm a DPS player. Like big number, make monkey brain go yay, clap. Like it's so straightforward that I feel like that's the most bizarre thing is that I think that's what it will likely end up becoming, but I don't know why it's such a struggle from the community against the devs to get there. When I feel like that's the clear endpoint that we're going to get to. I don't know I don't know why that struggle is so that or the tug of war or whatever you want to call it is so contentious because to me it just makes no sense. And I'm very confused. I don't like to me the mutual collaboration aspect and things like that that already happens plenty. It could happen more, sure. You can change, have a dedicated support class. I feel like that's kind of what healers are in a raid team oftentimes and to some extent even tanks. Um but you have stuff like Bloodlust, which is like the whole group gets this benefit, but you're still there's certain points in a fight where Bloodlust is maybe better or worse for certain classes or certain specs, depending on how their cooldowns line up or depending on what they're assigned on the fight or things like that, where there's already sometimes a mutual collaboration moment in a fight where everybody can plan around it and it's set out from the beginning and it might be better or worse for certain people compared to other people. But like to some extent, pretty much every raid team is going to have the same lust timings or something like that, or depending on what you're assigned on a fight, uh you can kind of mentally note in or out whether it's counting for you. Like, oh, I got assigned to do the mechanic on, Skullx. Skullx doesn't really have mechanics, but just for example, because that's the one that
Yeah.
came to mind. And so I'm in my rankings or whatever that I'm chasing logs for. I can just exclude Skolex from that because I know that I'm never going to be able to compete on that one fight because of my raid team. I'm assigned to do that mechanic. But the other 9, 10 fights in the raid, sure, I can compete on those. Whereas like PI, it's like it goes on the same person on every fight. It's not being changed around to people. That's on you, Blizzard, by the way, for not balancing classes better. But sure, blame the players for that. Maybe. It's going on the same person every fight. They're getting it multiple times in the same fight over and over again every time their cooldowns line up. It's not going on different people. It's not going on different people during a fight duration or whatever. It's going on the same class. The whole expansion almost like it's not even changing around to different people in different tiers depending on their tier set or their legendary. Like it's so. I feel like part of the problem is not that it's this the design of the buff itself. It's like all these other problems come into it where the tuning of classes or the lack of tuning of classes and the lack of class diversity or spec diversity that it was going on every fight and the balance of if it actually changed every fight of who it was going on, it might have more merit, but you didn't do anything to make that happen. So it's not the community's fault for complaining at that point. It's like you posed this problem to yourself and then didn't spend any effort in addressing the problem that you created and then blamed the players for experiencing the problem. And to me, it makes no sense and it's super frustrating. And I hate the communication that they've had on this so far. And I just want it to go away. I don't want to care about PI anymore. Caring about Bloodlust and timings and stuff like that and optimizing when I'm going to use my potions, when I'm going to save my cooldowns for Bloodlust, that's cool. Mutual collaboration, changes on certain fights might be better or worse for me than certain other people because I have a 1 minute cooldown versus a 1.5 versus 2 minutes versus 3 minutes. Poor Demon Hunters over there crying with their 3.5, 4 minute cooldown. And then that's cool. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with changing stuff, it being better for worse than other people, but like it's not every single fight, and it's not every single fight the same person, and it's not every single person the whole duration of the fight always on the same person. It's like it's so unneeded and unnecessary, and I don't understand why it exists or why it needs to continue to exist when there's other versions that just work so much better. That's my big rant. Sorry.
No, I think that's entirely reasonable. I think without diving too far into the priest tree, I think there are a couple of smaller anecdotes that could be. One that's most notable, just because I have a bit more of a PvP background, is you look at it. There's an option to pick mind control, but it no longer works on enemy players. And mind control has been an ability that's been in the game for quite some time now. I will not try to lie and tell you that I know when it was added or whatever. But
It might have been vanilla. I'm not
I
sure.
mean, who
Can you
knows?
clarify for me because I'm dumb and I don't play priest ever? Uh, if mind control is not usable on enemy players, what does it do?
Um, I'm sure that there could be some use for it as some form of CC in PvE. We will
But
take more of
how do
a
you use it then if it doesn't work on enemies?
because there was also a there was a legendary they had released, I want to say, that lets you also control your own character or something like that when you are mind controlling. Because previously it was mind control. You
Oh,
cast
it
mind
just makes them
control
like a pet instead of a. Yeah, I understand now.
essentially,
Okay.
but before it was you cast it and then you are looking through their eyes. It's almost as if you're playing their
Mm-hmm.
character. You don't have their buttons or anything. You see your channel time at the bottom of like how long you're channeling mind control. You
Yep.
can end it
And you just
early,
run them
whatever.
off the lumber mill ledge.
Yeah, yeah, that yeah, just that lovely location. But more specifically, what was noted was there were so many issues with this ability, especially more recently, that in PvP, when you would mind control for quite some
Yep.
time, I want to say in BFA, that it would cause the player to have those the lag spikes that you'll occasionally see in raid
The
where they're like
stuttering,
teleporting
jumpy movement.
around.
Yep.
Yeah, and that makes it dang near impossible in PvP to keep up with them because it is also based off of what you see as to what you can actually do. So you're melee chasing them around, you just can't keep up, or they're not getting CC even though they seem entirely in range and they were in range type of thing, right? So there's a lot to that. But I think what was important was they folded. They showed that they were not capable of making mind control a more reasonable ability that could work in a
Mm-hmm.
PvP scenario. I think PI is something that I would hope they take the same approach, that they do fold their cards, that they just say, we've accepted that it's not that enjoyable, or like you were saying, like that it's not a bloodlust for everybody. It's a bloodlust for one person. And the
Mm,
worst part is you have control over it. You want to be able to give it to yourself. As a disc priest, you want to be able to have a more powerful ramp, like on KT, that was pretty noticeable because you could like
mm,
three heal a fight more noticeably. Um, I'm sure it'd be enjoyable uh on a holy priest when you've got an innervate, you just cranking out extra heals. I feel like that would be very enjoyable on Rygalon, for example. As Shadow, entirely reasonable that you'd want your own. I think something that's been noted, there's been a couple of ideas out there. There's the again, we won't dive too deep into it, but in the priest tree, there's the option for the legendary right below PI that gives it, when you give it to somebody else, you get it at 100% effectiveness.
mhm.
And
That should just be baseline.
yes, but what's interesting is um,
Like
it's a
at
2 minute
the very
cooldown.
least, if you're not gonna change the damage and things like that, it will still feel bad when somebody else in your raid or somebody else in other people's raids, because you're comparing logs and things like that. It's often that I'm not comparing myself to the warlock in the raid. I said this in a tweet. I'm comparing myself to the other hunters in different raids in logs, and when they're getting PI and I'm not, and that makes a big difference. Like it feels unfair at that point,
Yeah,
and
and
it
no,
feels like
it does.
I don't really have the chance to compete with people, and that's the worst part to me. But I think if you're married to the idea, at the very least, priests should always get the benefit if they're using it on somebody else. That's bare minimum my expectation. But I also hope that they make further changes because I still think that's not good enough, and I still think that feels bad, and you could make it way better very easily. I feel like, and so yeah.
Yeah, and there have been a couple of ideas tossed around. The most notable to me was this concept where it's a 2 minute cooldown, and your burst as a Shadow Priest is like a minute and a half, right? With
Mm-hmm.
the Void form. So it doesn't even line up well. But if you made PI at 3 minute cooldown, you made it so you could give it to yourself and one other person, it wouldn't feel bad to give to somebody else, line up with your cooldowns as well, like all of that. Now, obviously, there's tuning around that and many things to consider. I definitely agree that it would be much better if PI were solo use only. Just make it that way, right? I am saying that a happy medium could be a 3 minute cooldown, but I do like your thought about making it baseline where it's given to yourself as well. I do think that these talent trees, if you look deeper into them, it does seem more reasonable to spend a point. And when we do end up talking about the priest tree, that is one of the main topics, is that you have to, if you want to spec in a damage, the most reasonable thing that you're removing is defensive capabilities. But
Mm.
we'll circle around back to that. I think the conclusion very much so is that PI is bad. There's not a lot of people in this game that want it.
In its current design, I will say, I think there is a version that can exist that's okay and way better at least than the current version. But its current design does not work. I think very clearly.
Yeah, that's true. Very true. I know that you also wanted to touch on M plus a little bit.
I did.
Unique
So
thought.
I I've been listening to people doing podcasts and things like that. I listen to Titan Forge. I listen to Max talk sometimes. I listen to Yummy TV Growl, whatever. I listen to a few JB. I follow on Twitter, of course. And
Who doesn't?
and there's always talk of M plus around like the meta and the meta specs, and especially with the recent Destrolock and now survival nerfs that are incoming that were going to happen and then got delayed for until season 4 and things like that. Is that people were talking about how the M plus meta develops, and we were talking about you know, Joe the Warlock, who,
Yeah.
because he's purple class, getting invited to his plus 10s and things like that,
Yep.
and how you can sort of take away the. I wanted to take away the importance of the meta from influencing what people feel like they should be bringing to keys or allowing to bring to keys and invite to their groups and things like that, especially for pugs. For or for like the Great Push and MDI and things like that, I think there's always going to be like preset comps, and you're going to know certain things going in, and you want to have more control over that environment and things like that when it's more competitive. I think that's fine. My crazy idea here is, first of all, I think keys shouldn't deplete. Like I think that's been a commonly requested thing. It just creates negative feelings for no reason. When like, okay, worst case scenario, you wasted time, but just go again. No big deal. Like
That's how it's in raids
the
right now. Yeah.
yeah, the losing out on the opportunity to get loot and stuff like that just feels like punishing people for trying to challenge themselves or do something like barely at the edge of their skill level. And like that's what you should want them to be doing. That's cool. They'll have fun doing that. Like you want them to do that and
Oh,
they'll get better and push even higher. Like that's the whole design of the system wants them to push higher. You can't punish them for doing what the system is incentivizing them to do. Like it seems weird
oh, hold on. Can
and contradictory to me.
you guys tell that Rio doesn't do M plus? You still get you still get loot if you don't time the key, which I think was a
Okay,
great.
what does depleting do now then?
No, that you
It's I thought it was you only get one piece of loot instead of two or something because you only
you
get the
do
piece of
get
loot if you time it.
so when it's over 15, there's a chance that you get additional loot, and I think that chance might increase the higher the key that you do. But in totality, what you're saying, what the options are to you when you're pulling the last boss of Theater of Pain, and you know that you're already over your timer. You've got a couple
Hmm.
options, right? You can leave the dungeon right then and there. If everybody
Hmm.
walks out, you reset it, you go back in, you have that same key but one level lower, which,
Right.
to the people that are pushing isn't useful at all. There's a lot of like individual push keys that they try to push +2 or whatever to get the key that they want. You
Right.
also have the option where if you just finish it, it'll give you a random key one below.
Yep.
So those are kind of the only options you have to you. And um, I think that the only issue that that could cause, I do like your thought of something not depleting. I think you should have the option if you want it to go down for it to go down. Uh, like the one that we have right now that you can
Yeah. If
lower
you
it
can
by
lower
up
it
to
like
10. Yeah,
in Orbos or whatever. Yeah.
yeah. So
I think you should be able to do that anywhere personally, but whatever. It's in
yes,
Orbos. It's fine.
yes.
um.
Please follow us into
Okay.
Dragonflight. Don't stay in
Yeah.
Orbos.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, so to continue with my crazy idea. So anyway, that was why those thoughts were sparking in my head and floating around in there. So my crazy idea is that when you're doing your weekly 15 keys or whatever for your Great Vault and things like that, if you're just signing up to a dungeon, I think when you plug a key in, it shouldn't tell you what the affixes are at all. Even tyrannical and fortified, there shouldn't be a weekly rotation of affixes because I also want to get rid of the idea of there's push weeks and non-push weeks, and there's weeks where there's tons of groups in M plus, and there's weeks where it's completely dead and nobody wants to do keys at all, and they do 15s for their vault, but they're not pushing keys at all and things like. I feel like having the participation be like if I want to play keys as a player, I should be able to play keys, and I should have people around to do keys that also want to do keys and play with. There shouldn't be this weird weekly rotation thing that like arbitrarily decides like do other people want to do keys this week, and then the almighty judge ruler of the universe says no, and then you're just stuck, or nobody wants to do keys that week, or you can't push as high or something like that. So
Yep.
I think the affixes should be random, so that it's not like, oh, this spec is busted on fortified weeks, and that spec is only busted on tyrannical weeks. It's like the specs become more general, uh, useful based on their utility and things like that. Because they were also talking about certain specs having a a reason to bring them basically, where it's like if Mistweaver is just so weak in M plus, why would you ever bring a Mistweaver? And it's like, okay, well they give Mystic Touch, woohoo. But it's like if Windwalker and Brewmaster are so much better in their role relatively compared to Mistweaver, which is maybe the worst healer in M plus. I don't know. I'm
It
just throwing that out
is.
there. I think it is. Yes. That it's like you'll never bring the Mistweaver for the Mystic Touch. So if you're a Mistweaver player and not a tank player or a Windwalker player, but Monkey's your main class, you're just stuck and you can't do keys or something like that. Or the other problem is then that also means okay, you want to build a physical DPS comp, you want an MM Hunter and like a Fury Warrior or something. Then those classes also need to be within 5% throughput of the top specs. But when the top specs are like 50% better of Destrolock and Survival, like there is no reason to bring those classes anymore. So I'm also trying to solve the class issues and the spec issues mixed with the weekly issues and things like that. So I think for weekly keys, it should just be completely random. I think it might even be better if you don't know which dungeon you're doing and you just sign up and it's like a random queue
That
in a MOBA or an arena where you don't know what you're going to go up against. You're just prepared for everything and anything and you have to react to it when it comes. And I think if there's less punishes for not completing and timing the key, like maybe it gives you 3 options or something, and you choose one of the 3, but it's like random each time what the 3 options are, and you can like re-roll or veto one of them or something like that. I don't know how it would work, but I'm just saying make it more random and less structured. But I do think the other aspect is I also think it's cool to have like the great push where people are able to push a key and like you said, it doesn't deplete and they're able to just go in instantly and try again and actually push for timing the highest keys and things like that. So I think you also should have the option of saying, I don't want a random key. I want to do this dungeon at this level and we want to go in and try it over and over and over again and actually try and push the highest level of that key for like the people that are pushing for score and things like that. So I think you should have both options as players, but for the weekly 15 thing, especially, I think that should be random for the most part. Maybe you could make that controlled too, but I want to have a reason people would do the random aspect so that people aren't because the push weeks and stuff can then be like the great push locked in style. But that's only if you're locking in the key. You do those weeks affixes or something. But the rest of the time it's all random. I don't know. It's kind of my crazy idea. I didn't fully flesh it out, but that was my crazy idea. I'm curious what your thoughts are since you seem to
Um,
be more Mythic Plus oriented than I am at least.
I got a DM earlier that Rio was gonna have this cake that I wasn't allowed to know of ahead of time, and I wish you told me because I wouldn't let you say it. But
Oh
no,
no.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But this so I just want there's one very clarifying aspect I need.
Okay.
The affixes you said so like for a group that's pushing, let's just take Echo for example, right? It's hard to not take them as an example right now. They are wanting to push Theater of Pain, which in your example you said would be okay. If they wanted to choose a specific dungeon, they could just say Theater of Pain, right? They need a
Right.
higher score on it. But you
Yep.
said that the affixes would be random. Is there like
No, I think random. So like, if for example Echo is pushing for a 32 Theater of Pain, I think they're pushing for that shouldn't count for the weekly vault specifically. I think it can still count for score. I don't know if score matters as much in this universe, but
uh,
um
okay.
like I think it's like they're pushing 32 for the challenge of being the first people to do a 32, right? Like that's the point. It's not they're not doing it for the weekly Great Vault of gear. So the Great Vault was kind of the incentive to do things randomly. That was my motivating factor. Is if you're just doing your keys for your Great Vault, you do them on the random setting. If you're wanting to push for the challenge and being the world first and pushing the keys as high as possible just for the challenge of it and you like the competition aspect of it, that's when you're not doing that key for the Great Vault anymore. You'd have to do 8 other random keys during the week. Um, but you can push that and that has you're in more control over that aspect of it. And that's when you can control the comp and the affixes and things like that more and the dungeon specifically and things like that. And you can just lock it in and push as hard as you can. Like you said, exactly like a mythic boss where you go in, you know what the challenge is, you can tailor yourself to the exact challenge that you're encountering and push yourself as hard as possible to overcome that challenge and actually push to the ceiling of what the capability is of that group or whatever.
Okay.
Whereas the random aspect is like I said, it's more like queuing a random arena and getting the arena rating and like you don't know what comp you're going up against. It's almost even more like the solo shuffle where you don't know what comp you're going to have and you're just reacting to everything on the fly and it's more so like I think the like it's not RMP mirrors every time in solo shuffle, right? Like there's more usability aspect and there's also not weird weeks of arena where nobody plays arena, right? Like oh, it's not arena rating week, so we don't queue arena this week, guys. Darn shucks. Like people just queue arenas all the time because it's random and there's not control over it and any time to queue arena is as good as any other time, right? That's kind of my purpose of those.
Yeah. So you did answer my question in saying that you could pick the affixes too. That if you wanted to have whatever you thought the easiest ones were, you could do that.
I'm not sure if the affixes should be weekly rotation or if they should just pick. And if they
Well,
decide that bolstering whatever raging is like the best affixes to pushing a 32 in necrotic wake and maybe it's sanguine necrotic in I don't know, theater of pain or something like maybe those
well,
affixes are different. I think the problem is it's more likely that there's going to be a specific combination that's just universally the best. And so picking it might just be too strong and too one dimensional for pushing. So I don't know. I didn't fully flesh out that part, but
It is so
To be
obvious
fair,
that you don't do
there's
M
a I
plus.
know I'm choosing the worst epic combinations possible.
You did. You did. Fortify. Raging bull streak. Holy shit. Okay, but this so it, the affixes being random isn't is is an odd aspect of Mythic Plus, but it's almost one that's at this point because if you could just pick your affixes and you just chose them to be the easier ones, depending on the dungeon, right? There,
Mhm.
there would like score plays into it no matter whether you want it to or not. Like that's gonna be a large aspect of it. So like a 32 Theater of Pain is gonna be one of those things. Well, Echo did the inspiring fortified quaking Theater of Pain comfortably type of thing, right? Um, the the or to tie to the randomness aspect, like you said, that doing your weekly 15s just for the vault. What deters a player from walking in the dungeon and then they see it's necrotic, which is a terrible affix, by the way? Like, small anecdote, was teaching a tank friend how to play, was teaching him during necrotic week. Worst example. And he's a blood DK. Like, he just can't heal himself, right? But the the problem is what deters a group from just stepping outside the dungeon and going back in until they get the affixes they want. So I hear you about the randomness aspect. I think it'd be kind of cool to potentially do a random dungeon because there are times where you want to do a specific dungeon. There's times where you don't care. You just want to do a key. That's entirely fine. I do think you'd start to find it where people would prefer the shorter dungeons just because they're faster, like your gambits and your
Yeah,
mists, as opposed
that's a
to your
good point.
theater of pains and your sanguines. Um, so like I like the concept. I'm just kind of more interested in a further fleshed out version of it. So who knows? Maybe next week we'll
Maybe
talk
next week
about it
I will
again.
have better ideas, or it might be it
Uh,
might be dead in the water with some of those problems. That's true. Those are good points I hadn't thought of.
yeah,
See, this is why I need a person that actually plays M plus to help me.
yeah, that or we could just start queuing some M plus, and you'd have your own takes
Hey,
very soon
season
after.
4, I'm gonna have to again probably.
Season
So
4, you're gonna have to. Season 4, I'm gonna be teaching you what each mob does and all that. I can't
I
wait.
remember most of them. It's fine.
Just messing with you, but I don't think there's the thought of needing change to Mythic Plus is not out there. I think that
I
it
was gonna
does
say,
need
to me,
revitalization.
it doesn't make much sense the way it currently works, basically. And
It does.
there's clearly some sort of shakeup that I feel like is needed. And I don't know if my idea is the best version of the idea. It's probably not, especially with how uninformed I am of the actual intricacies of everything. But I feel like there's some shakeup is definitely needed where you shouldn't have dead weeks where people don't want to do their favorite thing in the game. Like that doesn't make sense to me.
I agree.
And
The
you
change.
shouldn't have people entirely unable to like a boomkin just can never get into keys when it's like or he has to make his own group.
That was
But
yeah.
he's also like disincentivized from doing that because his key can deplete and because you know he has to like I don't know all this nonsense like it should be so much more straightforward and so much more just like I sign up, I do a key, we do the key, the end. Like it needs to be much more streamlined process. I think
Yeah. I I agree. I think
where you're not caring about what week it is or what the classes you're getting are or what dungeon it is on exactly which week and all that type of stuff.
I think well, so to the
I,
solo
covenant bonuses on top of that is annoying too, but yeah,
yeah,
hopefully that's
that
gone
was
after this.
something yeah, very unique. Well, who
Mhm.
knows? We might get the blue dragon flight aspect thing that affects us. We don't know just yet, right? But
Yep.
I will say though, to the solo shuffle, the unique aspect in that is that you've got in solo shuffle a large determinant of how the game goes isn't the class. It's all about the player's skill. That's what determines it. Because you could have, a ret pally that arguably can blow somebody up really fast, but they aren't playing well, so they're not going to. Versus you could have something like what's an example of something that's just entirely dead in the water? I mean, you could argue a resto shaman trying to solo kill somebody. Let's just give that as an example, right?
Sure.
That, yeah, there's Esper Totem and all these little things, but the example being that it's all dependent on the player's skill as to how that match goes, regardless of and gear is an aspect too, right? Whereas in a key, in your random scenario, which in Group Finder you can get a survival hunter that does under tank damage. It's not
Yep.
common, but it's possible. I would say that a good way to approach it might be, they do individual tuning for PvP. That's not unheard of, and I think that's a great thing that they're doing because there's nothing worse than when a spec is doing incredibly well in PvE and you're a PvP and you're playing that spec and that spec is awful and you see your class get nerfed. It's like just the weirdest feeling ever, you know?
Yes, I
So
completely agree with that.
so I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that the moment that a keystone goes into the hole, that you tune that keystone or the classes in that keystone differently than you do in raid or PvP. I think that Mythic Plus, because it started as like a mini game or whatever. I made those jokes
Mhm.
with my friends saying that they only played the mini game while I raided, but
Uh-huh.
it's grown to a point that it is a powerhouse of
Yeah,
itself.
it's like a third pillar of endgame now, I feel like.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it was a really great addition to the game, but there needs to be, because of that, there needs to be its own tuning. There are Windwalker monks and Destro locks and survival hunters. Not that they're bad in raid or anything, like they do certainly well.
Right.
They Destro lock is just such an odd example, but
I mean,
you know,
I think it's safe to say the vast majority of tuning is on raid performance based, not Mythic Plus based.
yes,
And
yes.
the Mythic Plus tuning adjustments are occasional rare exceptions that aren't a regular commonplace thing,
Right,
standard to be
right.
expected. Yeah.
And the worst part is I've heard from Warlock friends when they saw that those nerfs, there are people that don't like playing Plus. And now the spec that they might want to play on, say, Anduin, because it performed well before, now will be outperformed by
Yes.
Demolog, which is something that they don't want to play. And
Yes.
yeah, this individual tuning is something that would need to occur. I know that it would require a much larger team to look at it or more time dedicated to it, but I think that it's proven that it deserves it. So yeah, that was a an out there take, but plenty that could be taken from it too, and an idea that I can't wait to see the iterations of. I want to see what comes of it when this is on our docket next time that we chat about it. But
Okay. I might have to shelve it for a little bit until I
for a little bit, but not too
get
long.
some better
Too
ideas.
long.
But all right, all right.
Speaking of out there takes, Twitter has been fairly polarizing as of late. I think everybody would agree.
There's been
Just
some
among
hot takes posted,
yeah, some
trying
hot
to
takes.
stir some responses for sure.
Yeah, I'll kind of let you take it though, because
Well,
THD and JB are unique voices in the community.
yeah. So I already touched on like the raid for world first tuning and raid nerfs and stuff like that, and like weak auras and all that jazz. So that was one aspect. We already covered that a bit. THD especially has been on a kick for a while where he wants Titan forging back, and no, please no.
Just no.
um, and so yeah, there was one aspect especially where it was brought up as like an alternative gearing path for M plus especially, and that just wasn't true. I played in Legion at the time. I won't go into all the math because I couldn't find the math I did back then on it. But basically, you physically couldn't play M plus enough and Titan Forge enough items at a high enough level to ever equalize the gear to raid. So raid has always been a superior gearing method, and Titan Forging didn't help Mythic Plus be an alternative gearing method to raid as a competitive viable option because it wasn't still. And yeah, uh, there's lots of ways. I think first of all, people often have the conception or misconception that like mythic raiders especially, but especially world first level raiders just want to play the game 24/7, and they always want to have like new content to be doing, new ways to power up their character and things like that. And I think THD is an exception here. I think he's a unicorn. I don't understand why he wants it back. I mean, I kind of do a tiny bit, but for the most part, I think a lot of CE Mythic players and especially World First Raiders, they like being able to do casual content and not have it be a forced grind to give character power levels increases and stuff like that. They like to do transmog farming. They like farming mounts. They like, you know, having farm period in the raid where the raid is easier, and they don't want to have Jailer be a 500 pull boss for every guild for the rest of the time. Like they're mostly fine with bosses being nerfed over time. They're mostly fine with having item level increases and getting Biss on their character and then being done with that character and being able to play alts and all those different things. So there's often a perception where like the mythic players or whatever always want the game to be the most grindiest, hardcore, try hard, no life experience. And I definitely think that's not the case. I think a lot of the people that love casual content the most and stuff are mythic raiders, and they like doing that stuff in their off time in raid and things like that. And they like that it's not a pressured, urgent, stressful thing that they have to figure out how to do the dailies optimally for rep every single day and every hour and the resets exactly and get all the rares every. They don't like doing that stuff. Like the people that like doing that stuff are aliens, and I don't understand them. But whatever,
Oh
they're
gosh.
they don't they're not the majority of people, I think. And it's not like the casual community is at war and up against the competitive community. I feel like we're on the same team, and we both want the game to be good, and we both want the game to be fun and have fun stuff to do, but we also don't want to feel pressured into having to play the game 24/7 to do all of it just to be competitive on our characters and stuff like that. We like being able to take breaks from the game or to not have to play the game every single day and be able to be done with the characters or play alts and things like that. So, it's not there's a war that I feel like both sides are fighting the wrong side, and there is no other side, and that they're both on the same side. And stop pointlessly fighting with each other and fight against. You could unify and fight against the aspects of the game that are causing those problems and try and get them changed, rather than just blaming the other side as causing the problem when they also don't like that and they also want it fixed in the exact same way that you do, and it doesn't make any sense. That's my one little spiel there.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because I agree that the concept of always having something to do to improve your character is probably not the best thing for WoW. I think
I think it's fine if it's very minor and like you could skip it or you could not. Like I said, the leech and tertiaries and things like that. I think that's a good aspect where that can exist where I
yeah.
could still feel like I'm progressing my character, but it's like I'm getting him 1% more effective or something at most, you know. Whereas it's like could you not get a second legendary? Like, not really. You just kind of had to do that because it was
Yeah.
like my character isn't half a percent better. It's like 15% better on this one item. And it wasn't like you had to do it eventually over the course of the patch. Like by the time you get to Jailer, you had to have the second legendary. It was like you had to do this in the first 3 weeks of the patch. Period. You could not take a break. You could not take a day off. You could not do it every other day. You could not do it all in one day. You had to do it every single day. It wasn't like you could, batch do it in giant chunks on the weekend or something and do it once a week or once every few days. You had to do it every single day.
Yeah,
I
and
There's definitely ways to change some of those systems to make it more reasonable for people. That it doesn't need to be a strict, structured, regimented, demanded thing of players where you can give them some leeway. Like I said, margin for error is good all around. Just give people a little bit of grace period leeway, and they will more than thank you for it. I promise.
yeah, that whole concept of farming reputation at the start of a patch, that's like one that I personally enjoyed. I would not enjoy it if it extended past the time that it did, but the ramifications of it were really interesting. So you look at right around that time was the Mage Tower, right?
Mm-hmm.
And actually, there were quite a few inappropriate bans that were sent out because individuals were logging in from a different computer for their same account, and it was just automatically assumed that they were purchasing a Mage Tower, uh, like, played by somebody else kinda boost, right?
Hmm.
The I've already known a couple of people that because they were banned around that time and were unable to play, they were set back at the start of this raid by a large time frame that they had to find other raiders to replace them for that time being, or another account needed to be started. So, yeah, this concept that, like, I've got a friend that wants to pick up the game, and yeah, the second Lego isn't, you know, that important because he can get his 265 belt one, but then there's the problem with the belt because that's where he wants his normal legendary to be, and all those little aspects.
Why are legendary powers restricted to certain slots? Why aren't they all just craftable on any slot? Why do I have a legendary that is only on belt or like head, but like I need the head because it's a tier item and I need my 4 set too. So it's like I only have the option of belt, and then I also only have the option of unity on belt. Why? Why does that exist? It's patched 9.2.5. Like this has been an issue in 9.0, and then you had to fix it going into 9.1 because you were adding the dumb shard items sockets, and you had to add certain extra slots for the certain legendaries that were in the domination shard slots. But then the domination shard slots weren't the same as the tier set slots. But then you didn't add any more going into season 3 for Sepulcher, and now you literally encountered the problem twice and you didn't decide to just solve it. You just left it as a problem. Why? I'm so frustrated.
Yeah, there were a lot of aspects like that that I think that if a a Shadowlands Classic were released with excessive changes, or people talk of private servers and stuff like that, I think that these are all things that would very much be on their list to include. I think that you can kind of do that for a lot of patches, and it's frustrating for us as players to see those things, um, because we're very much in love with the game. We want to continue playing it, and we want to see those changes, but
I
um,
want it to be the best game it can be, and when it's so obviously fixable and it seems like very quick and easy to do, I don't understand why it doesn't happen. It's just
I
I, I don't understand it.
it would almost be cool to have this sort of openness that the community has towards Blizzard and their decisions in reverse. Like if Blizzard were to have a podcast, because in the past they've done community things where they have a set question, they have set questions that they will be asked or would be comfortable answering, that type of thing.
I think that the interviews that they do with like, well, in the past it was Preach, but they've done it with Sloot. They've done it with, um,
Asmongold now.
yeah, Asmongold did one. They did it with Taliesin and Evitel.
Yep.
I'm trying to think of a couple other people that I've remembered in the past. I can't remember off the top of my head, but
Some other.
those should be like a once a month standard practice. I feel like not like a once every 6 months to a year that you get one at the start of Shadowlands and then like one in 9.2.5 and that's it. Like you got two the entire expansion. The expansion's been out for like a year and a half, almost 2 years. Like these should be a once a month thing as a standard where Ian sits down, he answers like 15 to 20 questions that the community has at the forefront, and it's coming from people that play the game regularly, that are somewhat competitive players that are, playing different aspects of the game. Have one for PvP. Have one do it with Venruki or Zaryu or uh
They've done those, but yeah.
Bajira or any of those people. Like those people Stoops for a long time. Like those people care about their place in the game and they want it to be the best version possible. If you listen to their suggestions, like they will help you make the game better. They can point out the areas that you might not be paying attention to, that you might have missed or overlooked in development or something like that. That you can have a couple of people dedicated to, all right, we launched this. Oh, the PvPers are, there's this one issue that's cropped up because of the way these systems interact. Let's go in and fix that and have a person dedicated to doing those little tweaks afterwards that just fix the weird pain points that are always going to pop up. Like I'm not expecting them to predict all this stuff in advance out the gate and like you're never going to anticipate all the ways that players are going to interact with the system, or all the different, because every player is different in the way that they interact with stuff. Like, you're never going to anticipate all that stuff. I'm not expecting them to see the future. I'm They're humans, they're going to be fallible, they're going to make mistakes. It's completely understandable, but you should have systems in place to go back and fix them, not just leave them broken. I feel like, and that's where the issue is for me. Where it's not that the mistake was made in the first place; it's that it was left alone and just left by the wayside for forever, and it never gets changed. And that's it. It's disappointing as a player because I see all the ways that the game could have been so much better than it was, and it's already pretty good. I have fun playing the game, but it's like it could be so much better, and they're 95% of the way there, and they just aren't able to get that last 5%, and I can see it. It's within reach, and it never gets there, and it's the difference, not necessarily in the expectation, but I don't know. You can see the possibility, and you can see
Yeah,
how close you are to getting there, and it's like
I the
I don't
the
know.
the only correlation that I can make, right? Like we have to try to see through their eyes too. And the only correlation that I can make is when work is so busy for me that we're in a hypothetical scenario, in a situation where work is just so busy that you have so much stocking up that you like maybe you have documents to sign or whatever it
Yeah,
may be
you
that you
lose
do
track
it
of the small stuff. It's
no, no, no,
definitely
no.
not.
Not even that. That you are so focused on what's to come that the second you're done with something and it goes out, that you can't take a second to look back at what's been submitted. Right?
Yes,
Like you are just so focused on what's to come just to
like for
maintain it.
now, they're obviously focused on Dragonflight. Like I think that's pretty clear to me at this point. They've
Right.
probably done most of their stuff that they're going to do for season 4, and they're as soon as season 4 ships, like it's out the gate or whatever, like I said, I don't think they're going to do tuning adjustments to the faded affixes or anything. I think they're going to be how they're going to be, and they're focused on Dragonflight at this point.
I think
But I
uh,
think it would be good if they had, as part of their like production development cycle of the game, that they had at least a couple people dedicated to doing those after the fact retroactive tweaks and fixes to the small stuff that pops up.
yeah, I agree. I think
That's their whole job. That they are freed from having to focus on the new thing, basically. Because yes, I am fully sympathetic that yeah, they're always going to be, they're juggling the live game and developing the next thing coming down the pipeline, or probably the next two or three things down the pipeline at the same time, and that's
and then
not only hard but probably impossible
and
to
then
do adequately. Or like I understand that, but don't have one person doing all that stuff.
and then also juggling the classic argument as to whether or not there should be a dungeon finder or something like that. Like we don't need to
I
go
think
into
the
that,
classic
but
team is a different team, thankfully.
yeah,
But
yeah.
yes, there is also another entirely separate, loud vocal community that they are also contending with, and yes, of course.
Yeah, and we can be more hopeful going to Dragonflight. That's kind of all that we can do at this point. We can also choose to pick our battles. A good example when we talk about PI is like Alamazi, an example, Warlock that gets PI, but does not want PI to be in the game. He's been very vocal about
Mhm.
it, and he saw it come out in the
That's
tree.
how you know that it probably should be changed, right? Like
Yeah,
if the person that you're saying we're mutually collaborating, we're gonna make this guy feel awesome, and he's saying I don't feel awesome. You're like, huh? Might be an indication we should look at that.
yeah, and it's like he's at the point where he's like, I've fought PI. The second he saw it in the tree, he's like, I'm just beyond that battle. Just might play the game a little bit less. And that is the result that you're going to see in the player base. Right? You
Hmm.
very much want to aim for an enjoyable game. Um, and I think that we would be lying if we said that we didn't think that was in their hearts. That they care a lot about the game. I think it would be interesting to see the behind the scenes as to why a lot of these things aren't working, or why changes aren't being made to aspects that we
Yeah,
think should be made because
it's
they're
definitely not because they don't care. It's clearly like a, I don't know, bureaucratic administrative like issue in either the chain of communication, or uh just the production pressure that they have on meeting certain deadlines from either higher ups in the company or just their own deadlines they set for themselves that they're too ambitious with. There's clearly it's a breakdown in the process itself. It's not that these people aren't uh like emotionally and professionally like invested in making something good and fun. Like they clearly want to do that. All the people working on the game clearly, I think, care a lot about making the game good at to the best of their ability. They're just not being given the right environment to make that the actual best it can be. They're being artificially limited by the additional pressures being placed on them in the process.
Yeah, yeah. Very.
I think the player base does try to help them though. Like at the beginning of the patch, I remember people saying, um, Destro is underpowered on single target, but don't just aura buff the spec because the AoE is already insane. And I remember them saying that and saying like only nerf or only buff Chaos Bolt or whatever. And I remember them saying that like they were trying to be helpful, and then Blizzard at some step in the communication process doesn't get that communication loud enough to some extent. I don't know how, but and then they come in and they aura buff the spec by 5%, and it's like I know what you're doing. I know why you're making this decision. I know what you're trying to help. I know what you're trying to fix. But there was a missed communication somewhere in the process where we were trying to be helpful and let you know ahead of time, don't make this mistake. And then because that never got all the way through to the other side of the people who needed to hear it, the mistake happened. And that's
Yeah.
when it's frustrating for me when it's like, what can the player base do at that point? That's all I want to know as a player is like, what else should I do? How can I help you more? Because I feel like I'm doing everything in my power possible to help you, and it still doesn't work. And I hate that feeling of powerlessness when I care so much and I want to see the game succeed and be better than it is. And it's like, I don't know how else or what more I can do to help at that point. I just feel lost and powerless and hopeless. And it's like, no matter what I do, the game isn't going to get better because even if I give them the exact thing that they're asking me for and the exact thing that I need to help them with, it still isn't good enough. And it's at that point that's when it's the most frustrating I feel like for me. But
Yeah, and there are changes that, like the legendary change we talked about, that seems so black and white that it's like it's very clear that that would be a good change. It's one that hasn't been made. I could understand why very early on why they wouldn't have done that. Maybe it was because they
I
wanted
think it
to.
was a flavor thing or something. But at this point, I mean, is the game going to be worse if I can craft my legendary on gloves, belt, legs, boots, ring, neck? Like, is the game worse because of that? Did I lose out on the flavor? Not really. Does anybody care about that flavor? I don't think so. Like, people care about like the Night Elf storyline and Sylvanas' storyline. Like, that's the big picture stuff. People don't care about what slot my legendary was crafted on. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like you got to pick your battles sometimes, and I feel like sometimes they choose weird stuff, and I don't know if it's certain people are super nostalgic for this one item was only on a certain slot and it felt important because of that in the past. Like I don't know if it's a weird RPG philosophy thing that they have from the past that is just it hasn't been properly kind of reevaluated in the modern day of stuff, but I feel like you should always be reevaluating your decisions and asking like, if we change this, is the game going to be better or worse? And a lot of times the answer is just, if it's better, just do it. It's that I feel like it's that simple and it's that easy, but I know it isn't. But yeah. Anyway,
Yeah. I trying to think.
I wish it was that simple and easy. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, it certainly would be enjoyable. And the one thing I will say though is that I am hopeful. I know that a lot of the player base has continuously said that, but there was very clearly a change in mindset starting with 915,
Mm-hmm.
with a lot of the adjustments that were made. Now we've got cross faction, all these little things that, the
Mm-hmm.
community was very much fighting for, and I'm hoping that this sort of uh
I think the game is definitely on the right trajectory now, and
yes.
I'm not sure that I would have said that in the past for sure. And like, is there always going to be pain points and mistakes made along the way and things that don't get changed? Probably. It's probably inevitable. It's probably never going to be perfect. Like, but I think at least in the big picture, especially, it's on the right trajectory now, and I'm very glad that they listened to that extent and they were able to reevaluate their philosophies going forward and and listen. And yeah, I'm happy about that. So I am also hopeful.
Yeah.
I don't want to be negative, although sometimes I feel like I might come across that way. I'm definitely
Well,
I'm vocally negative and quietly positive, which is probably not the best way to do things, but it's hard to reiterate that yeah, the game is fun the 100th time. Like
yeah.
I still play the game. I think that's proof of enough, even
Yeah.
if I might not say it all the time.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we can kind of look to end it on that higher point. I know that in a future episode we will very much be discussing uh talents, the trees that we're starting to see at the moment. We have
Hopefully more than just priest.
yeah, hopefully more than just priest, DK, and druid. That would be nice to see. We'll obviously do some form of a deep dive on those as they come out. But look for that in episode 3. Any closing points for you?
I don't think I have much. I think
All right.
I said I think the good high note was a good one to end on.
All right. Well, then we will see you guys in a week or two. Thanks.